Welcome back to another recording of the Israel Connection, a live session where we unpack current events in Israel and focus on major events as part of a conversation. My name is Dean Baghdadi, and I'm the senior Shaliach at Pozez JCC. Let's begin.
Whoever been following up with the news. When I started this slide last week, I wanted to focus on something completely different, but we cannot ignore or move on without talking about recent events that happened the last 2 days, which one of them is, of course, a terror attack happening in Tel Aviv, where one of the patrol officers, a security guard named Chen Amir, was killed when an unidentified man who seems very suspicious to the two of them. There was a couple of security guards walking towards him. He did not respond to one of their callings and then start shooting, killing Chen Amir, and get killed by the other partner of Chen, therefore saving lives of many others, which seems to be a planned terror attack on Tel Aviv. Laid to rest Chen Amir, and it is an unfortunate event, but it also seems to be fortunate because it held up a much larger event from happening. And it is worth mentioning, even if we're not going to dive into the details or talk plainly about this or what does that mean, it definitely deserves a reminding. Now, in addition to that, and equivalent to that, if you may, at the same time, there was another escalation in Judea and Samaria where it seems to be a riding starts between settlers and Palestinians over some form of dispute. I didn't really dive into it, but it's definitely something that we talked a lot about in Israel. One of the settlers, as part of this, right, eventually pulled a gun and shot dead one of the Palestinians. Now, there are a lot of callings from right-wing members of the coalition saying to name him a martyr, to praise him for protecting his own lives and by so killing the Palestinians. And on the other hand, some folks are trying to compare those two events to one another. When one of them, we have a victim of terror, and on the other hand, something that is defined that way. Now, those are two very different cases that are happening at the same time, but in a complete different environment. There are some media tools right now trying to equalize the two of them or talk about the two of them as two parts of the same equation. Unfortunately, to my perspective, this does not seem to be the case. And this seems like a provocation that went wrong. I definitely want to keep you updated with stuff that are meddling with Israel's business, so it's definitely worth mentioning, but we're not going to really talk about those. I just couldn't move on without mentioning it. What I am going to talk about is something not as controversial, which is the agreements with Saudi Arabia, the development, and what does that mean? So until Monday, the progress was the same progress as it was for the past few weeks. We've heard Thomas Friedman writing a column to the New York Times specifying that the US has a lot to gain from this agreement, Israel has a lot to gain from this agreement, and Saudi Arabia has a lot to gain from this agreement. We're obviously talking about a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia, the US, and Israel, which each one of them gaining something out of that agreement. Now we're going to dive in to exactly what are the forces that are playing and what is the advantage of each one of those countries, right, in the gaining. Today, and this makes my job a lot harder to keep up with everything, but while I'm editing the slides, more news are coming. Earlier today on Monday, Netanyahu gave an interview to Bloomberg, an American news media, where he was interviewed and asked about what's happening right now with the Saudi Arabia agreement. Before that, the picture was like so. The Saudi Arabia, as part of this agreement, is requiring from the US large agreements of weapons, including the F-35, and a military pact similar to NATO between those two countries. Now, to remind us, Saudi Arabia is definitely a leader of the Arab world. It is definitely a determined force, and has a lot to gain, right, from this pact. But at the same time, it is also in conflict with other Arabic countries such as Iran, which is bordering with, and Yemen. And this obviously comes as part of this larger conflict, which is a regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, and also trying to stage Saudi Arabia not just as a leader in the Arab world, but as a leading force in the Western world in general. This is what Saudi Arabia can gain from this agreement. And this was the picture before that. The US, as part of this agreement, can gain a lot of benefits from trading with Saudi Arabia. As we all know, with the war between Russia and Ukraine is gaining. And recently developments in that as well, probably going to mean more sanctions going towards Russia with its latest attacks on Ukraine's chain of supply. This definitely means that the Western world and the US specifically needs resources that Saudi Arabia has. Now, there are trading relationship between the two of them. There are trading relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US. There's definitely some uphills and downhills in those relationships, as we all know, about the suspicious disappearance of Khashoggi, a journalist that went to Saudi Arabia and never came back. He was charged to be murdered by Saudi Arabians. There was a lot to it, and Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. It is not a liberal country, and there's not even no one's trying to pretend that it is. It is a monarchy. It is being led by monarchs, with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, its leader. But there's definitely an advantage for the US normalizing a relationship with this country, both as a leader of the Arab world and uh, heavily resourced country as well, with oil, gas, and other valuable resources for production. Now, not only that, but when you look at Biden administration and the fact that we're leaning towards elections, presidential elections in a year from now, this can definitely be a win for Biden gaining from this agreement. Now, obviously, there's a lot in stake. And for the US side, they want to see a lot of, there's probably going to see a lot of requirements for getting closer to Western values in terms of Saudi Arabia as part of this agreement, and seeing, gestures of goodwill from both sides. Now, if it was only between Saudi Arabia and the US, it was easy. But unfortunately, it is not the case, and Israel is also involved in this situation. It is not unfortunate because Israel is involved. It's unfortunate because it makes things more difficult and challenging for all sides for these normalizations to be acceptable upon. Now, Israel is definitely the gateway to the Middle East for the US. It always has been the case. And there's always seemed to be a spark interest between those three corners of the same triangle, with Israel, the US, and the Arab world. Now, when regarding the relationship Israel and Saudi Arabia has, those are much more complicated. There are definitely have been in the past some tradings between Israel and Saudi Arabia, but there's never really been a relationship connection between the two of them. There was never a written down agreement. There was never a normalized relationship. And as we've seen in the past few years, ever since the Abraham Accords, normalization of relationship has been occurring with more and more Arabic countries. Now, again, to be reminded, Saudi Arabia is a leading force in the Arab world. And that means a lot when it comes to the relationship with Israel, with the Zionist movement. Because at the same time that those two countries can benefit from an agreement between each other, there's also the Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Saudi Arabia has been in relationship with the Palestinian side. They've been supporting them financially. They've been supporting the PA financially, and they have been a support as part of the leading force in the Arab world. Definitely. Now, as part of this agreement, Saudi Arabia is also expecting Israel to make steps, positive steps towards the Palestinians in order to gain an agreement. And we're not just talking about a promise to not annex future fields. There's not necessarily written down demands yet from the Saudi Arabia, but there's definitely tensions coming from that side, demanding advancing steps when regarding the relationship between the Palestinians and Israel. Not just about territory, not about geography, not about type A, B, or C territories, but also about the relationship. Now, to remind us all, this government is very right wing, and there is a right wing part of this government that is promoting annexation. We've seen that live with more and more settlements being built and housing being approved, and also certain steps that the civil administration led by Smotrich is taking in order to gain more control in certain territories. This will make Netanyahu's life even harder in order to gain some benefits that he can eventually promise to the Saudis regarding disagreements. Now, Israel, obviously, just like the US, has a lot to gain from these agreements. This is definitely a win for Netanyahu, a win for Biden, a win for MBS. And gaining this will definitely gain some favors in lost voters, as we've seen in Israel. Although, again, this is something that is more of a public opinion. So there's confliction between how would this affect Netanyahu's position. But it is definitely something that's going to challenge how we view the relationship right now. Now, in an interview that Netanyahu gave this morning to Bloomberg, one of the American news medias, he said that the Palestinians are not going to be a challenge. You can take that from a lot of different perspectives. What does that mean? Does that mean that it will be easy passing those stages? Well, that requires a give and take relationship with the right-wing side of the coalition. Will Netanyahu's government have to give up something to the right wing in exchange for those benefits for the Palestinians? This is a large question. This is a heavy question. And this is definitely something to keep up and follow up in the upcoming days, because this is an interview given this morning. So there's very much going to be impact and ripples we'll see following that interview. And also, of course, the agreements themselves ongoing. And this is really, really interesting because this is definitely a changing force in the relationship. Saudi Arabia is not just another Arab country that the normalization can benefit all sides. This is a leading force in the Arab world, and this is something that we do not normally perceive. Changing the relationship with Saudi Arabia does mean changing the relationship with all other, at least Sunni Arab countries. This is a lot. And because there's a lot in stake, we might see a change, either in the Israeli government, in the Biden administration, or in Saudi Arabia regarding this whole triangle. But it is definitely interesting to keep up and seeing how this one's going to develop. Obviously, again, everything changes by the minute, so it might have already been changed by the time I'm speaking with you, but this is definitely what it is at the moment. Any questions, comments, reactions regarding Israel, America, and Saudi Arabia?
What do the right wingers in Israel think about the relationship with Saudi? Are they for it, against it, don't care because their big issue is the Palestinians? If they're in favor of the relationship with Saudi, it would seem that would push them towards the direction of moderation, what they're doing on the West Bank.
This is an internal conflict because if your whole agenda is what's happening in the settlement, then giving up on what's happening in the settlement because of a relationship with another country can definitely mean losing your base, right? Those politicians are not just doing what they want, they're playing to their base. They're playing by what they voters wanted. And if it means, right, unrevoking certain territories, that is unacceptable by right-wing politicians.
Well, it sounds like they're captive to their voters the same way the Republicans are in the United States, where the Republican politicians here are terrified to do anything that will annoy the base. So I guess my question, one step deeper, what do the right-wing voters in Israel think about the relationship with Saudi? Do they care about that, or is that just over the hill and they're much more focused on the West Bank settlements?
I think if we knew that answer, we could cover so much ground. What do right-wing voters want? This is an interesting question because it is part of a larger discussions right now, which is, do we determine what right-wing voters want just by elections, or do we have to go back to public opinion regarding every single thing, or there is a mid ground? If you ask the current government regarding to that specific questions, they will say, we count only what the voter thought the day of the election. And if that is the case, then what do the voters want right now could be irrelevant regarding polls, regarding public questionnaires. This is a good question, and it is a very hard one to answer, both about do politicians take in calculation what do the voters think. I think normally they do. And at the same time, do voters agree with Saudi Arabia? What weights more, right? The relationship with Saudi Arabia or the relationship with the settlements, or certain gestures that the government will do? This is a big question. And I think once we get a more practical suggestion or requirements from the Saudis regarding to what do they actually want from this relationship between Israel and Palestine, then we'll have to see the actual developments going between them. I don't think you'll get any reaction before that, just because it is unclear what is actually in stake. Does that cover your question, Gabe? As much as I could.
It does. It does. Thank you. Yeah, as you said at the beginning, a lot of moving parts and conflicting agendas.
Definitely conflicting agendas, definitely moving parts, and not just internally in Israel, right? Because right now we're seeing a conflicting agendas between Israel and the US regarding the government, right? Biden has opposed the reform as it was passed. Biden's administration has opposed the reform as it was passed. And Netanyahu's government seems to go with it without its support. Now, that is definitely a challenge, especially if we're talking about an agreements coming from all of those sides with the Saudis. It is definitely challenging, and it is definitely also an opportunity to take a look at the Arab world and take a look specifically at Saudi Arabia as a leading force, right? Only recently, only a few weeks ago, Saudi Arabia has signed an agreement with Iran regarding truce.
You just talked to just a couple seconds ago about Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Iran. If Saudi Arabia establishes diplomatic relationships with Iran, do you think do you believe that Israel will sort of back out of diplomatic relationships with Saudi Arabia?
So there's a few answers to these questions, and the first one is, this is not necessarily about Israel, right? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Iraq, all of them are bordering neighbor countries, and all of them are involved in armed conflict. Iran, either close or already at nuclear level. That is definitely an alarming thing to know, especially if you're bordering countries with them. Iran and Saudi Arabia has 100 kilometers border, very wide, very influenced. And also in south of Saudi Arabia, there's Yemen, who's experiencing a civil war that is affected by Iran. The rebels in Yemen are connected directly to Iran, who are supporting this armed conflict in order to undermine Saudi Arabia's security in all frontiers. Iraq, we know what's happening. Iran, we know what's happening. And Yemen. And that creates a threat for Saudi Arabia. And that's why, to an extent, we've seen a warmth between the diplomatic relationship of Iran and Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. Now, as part of this agreement with the US, Saudi Arabia is also asking for nuclear development kind of like approval. from the US. Now, by all means, and I could be wrong on this one, whenever you're trying to develop nuclear power, does not necessarily mean you're going to do it for friendly benefits. This is definitely an attempt by Saudi Arabia to gain security. Now she is addressing the West, she's addressing the US to gain that security because the relationship with Iran are complicated. And there is no other leading force in the Arab world apart from Iran right now that can create that balance, and that could be the US. Saudi Arabia has a lot to gain from this relationship, not just because it can gain from that, but also because at the moment, Saudi Arabia seems to be in a disadvantage. And there's no, it doesn't just address the US out of goodwill. This rarely happens when it comes to foreign relationship. Saudi Arabia is in need of more allies. And because of what's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine, right? And with the heavy economical duty Russia is taking, Russia, it seems, less and less valuable ally, specifically to Saudi Arabia. And if Russia will no longer play a part, and the European Union is definitely going to take part with Saudi Arabia because it's not a liberal democracy. It's addressing the US, it's addressing Israel as part of this agreement. That could mean that they're also willing to give away some of the, let's call it, initial requirements to an eventually an agreement. That's why it's complicated. That's why there's so much moving parts, not just between the relationship between Israel and the US, but about the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia to Israel, right? It's all going to be very interesting to see how it develops. But at the moment, each one of those three countries has a lot to gain and a lot to lose from not doing this agreement. Moving on, I've decided to talk about something less controversial. We're going to talk about the soccer, specifically politics in soccer. Now it hurts my feelings to say soccer and not football, but I'll recover. I'll definitely recover. And I wanted to talk specifically about one soccer player, Munas Dabu. Munas Dabu is an Israeli Arab, Palestinian Israeli Arabs. He is of Arab identity, Muslim religion, and holds an Israel citizenship. Munas Dabu played for the Israeli team, the Israeli national team in the World Cup. During Operation Guardian of the Wall, which was in 2021, Munas Dabu uploaded a status, which was something from the Quran that definitely was perceived by Israelis as you deserve it. It seems, at least from this status, that he was happy with what's happening back then. We were talking about riots that were in Jerusalem, riots that were in Lod. A lot of citizens were hurt as part of this armed conflict, which was part of Guardian of the Walls, not only the operation in Gaza, but also the reaction within Israel by Israeli Arabs, igniting cars, performing acts of violence on the streets. And as part of that, he uploaded a status saying, God provoked something. I don't recall the actual quoting. But this definitely upsets a lot of Israelis, calling it supporting of terror, even the extremist ones were. He deleted the status, apologized in public, but the public opinion in Israel remained the same. After that incident, attempt or removal, however you want to address it, every time he played for the Israeli teams, he was booed by the fans. Every time he scores for the Israeli team, he was booed by Israeli fans because they did not longer accept him, or as a playable, as decent enough to play for the Israeli teams. Now, again, whether you agree with this or not, whether you think it's good or not, I want to focus on Munas Dabu itself, right? An action has been made, a reaction is not what he is taking, eventually leading to his quitting from the Israeli national team. He said that he can no longer take it, that he does not agree both with wearing the Israeli uniform or the reactions of the fans, and he just quit, which was again July, that was a year ago. Before and after that, also National League teams also play in financial leagues. So he was playing in European League, he was playing in the German team, I don't recall the name, but in July, he started playing for El Ali, Shabab El Ali team, a team for the United Emirates as part of the Asian League. Now, next week, Shabab El Ali, the United Emirates, the Dubai team, which Munas the Bull is playing, is going to play against El Wihdat. El Wihdat is a Jordanian team. Not only familiar for being Jordanian, but if you know the patterns of refugees moving through Jordan, you know that El Wihdat is a Palestinian team. It is very much recognized with the Palestinian people of Jordan, those who live, the refugees in Jordan, which create an interesting interaction. On the one hand, we have a Palestinian team going to play against a United Emirates team with an Israeli player. Now, El Wihdat is refusing to play against Dubai because in their views, Munas Dabur is a Zionist. Munas Dabur holds an Israeli citizenship and he plays for the Israeli team. And that is enough to recognize him as part of the Zionist entity, if you may. Munas Dabur has quit the national Israeli team because the Israeli fans grew up on him, because there was an incident that creates this tension between him and the team and the Israeli fans, and he eventually quit. For him, as an Israeli Arab, he may identify himself as Palestinian, he may not. This is definitely a process, and I do not want to determine it. He is now going to face a disagreement from the Palestinians who live in Jordan, who view him as an Israeli. This match is happening next week, 15th of August. And this is a really, really good example of how complicated the relationships are within the Arab world, right? And we're not even counting in the Israel side, the Jewish side of all of it. This is just between the Arab world that is in the region, Jordan, Palestinians, and Israeli Arabs. This is not even including the Jewish part as being part of it. And this is a really good example of it. Please, if you have any comments or reaction, or else I'm just going to continue to talk, so go ahead. It is a lot to take in. It's a very complicated matter. You think?
Dean, I think what it illustrates is that the complexities can actually happen in somebody's head, where he has multiple identities. Is he a soccer player? Is he an Israeli? Is he a Palestinian?
Definitely. And from if you look from his perspective, it seems like no matter what you do, you cannot win this, right? If you play for the Israeli teams, you are hated by the Arab world, but you also hate by Israelis that thinks that you're an Arab. Or for his case, he made an incident that caused that. But then if he quits the team, he still counts as a Zionist for Palestinians who live in Jordan or Syria or Lebanon when playing against other teams. Now, it is very interesting indeed. I agree with you. It's very complicated as well. Now, this is still in cover. Obviously, the match is happening next week, so we'll have to see about this one. But there's definitely going to be tension rising. But I wanted this one to be brought just because I just think it's a brilliant example of the complexity of the Arab world.
Hi,
Yes.
Phyllis, I've got a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Is there any law or regulation in Israel about Palestinians who are Israeli citizens supporting the Palestinians? Does it do anything to their citizenship in Israel.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, if they're if they have Israeli citizenship and they're Palestinian, and they're
Okay.
either, speak up for the Palestinians, for example.
Mhm.
Does it do anything to their Israeli citizenship, or do they have free speech to do that?
Most Arab representatives in the Knesset speaks for the Palestinians. They're elected one time after the other. To an extent that there's now been accusations against them that they're dealing too much with the Palestinians and too little with Arab society within Israeli borders, that they're leffing it, that it's been left for violence and economical disadvantage because the representatives are dealing too much with the Palestinians conflict and the Palestinian sides, rather the Arabs that live within the Israeli borders. Now, again, regarding Palestinians, this is a self-identification thing, right? Arabs is the culture, Islam is the religion, and the Palestinians, to an extent, could be counted as an ethnicity.
Right.
Most Arab representatives, some of the Israeli and Jewish representatives as well, are promoting support of the Palestinians, promoting change within the relationship, not just from the Arab side. And this is not new. This is definitely something that has been occurring for quite a while now. It's mostly identified with the left-wing part of the politics in Israel, but there is no law that prevents it or
Okay.
discourage it.
Thanks.
There is an aspect of raising the Palestinian flag that might count as trying to provoke. In certain areas, it is definitely not illegal, and it's definitely prescribed as a provoking kind of like action, but there is no law that doesn't allow it to an extent. On the contrary, this is the center of conversation, and the most critic about it right now is the fact that we're dealing too much with what's happening outside of Israeli borders in Judea, Samaria, in Gaza, and not focusing on the Israeli Arab society that within Israel that is lacking infrastructure and is infested with violence. Something that has happened this week as well. We might talk about this one next week. That's a great idea for this. So thank you. We'll definitely try and talk a bit more about it, about the Arab society and the difficulties right now. This could be an interesting conversation. All right. So, and for you who are joining in every week, we can't end up on the bitter note and have to find something that's interesting and not depressing that happened in Israel this week. Israel talent group called Bomba joined America's Got Talent and performed, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, a very interesting act of how to play matkot, an Israeli game similar to ping pong, and they did that fully nude. Now, I spared the picture from you and showed one with him more covered. It's needless to say, they got 4 yeses from the America's Talent team. I encourage you to go and view the show. It's an interesting one. It's definitely interesting. It definitely got a 4 yeses, so that we're going to see more of them if you're keeping up with America's Got Talent. But this was just, a funny kind of like escapism moment where you can view how this could be played out. They performed fully naked, only hiding their private parts using the rackets. And when asked by the panels if this is something that is common in Israel, they obviously answered not yet. But it was just a brilliant comic moment of just 3 weird Israeli guys trying to make it to America's Got Talent. It was just a funny video, which leads us to our last part of the presentation, which is what else? Anything else? Any questions? Any headlines you saw in the past or the recent days that you want to ask about or bring up to the rest of the group? This is definitely your time to ask questions, comment, react about this session, about anything that happens. So just go with it.
What's up? What is up with Netanyahu's judicial prosecution? That seems to be dragging on forever.
That's unfortunately is the Israeli judicial system. It is not the first case that has been dragged out. This is something that is very common. Um, Regarding specifically the judicial overhaul, we're talking about the passing of the reasonableness bill. The date for discussion that's going to be in court is September 15th. I recall, maybe 12th. I don't, maybe one of them. And it's the first time that all 15 Supreme judges are going to participate in one discussion regarding this specific one. And it is because the Supreme Court's never dealt with basic laws in the past. It is the first time that the Supreme Court is going to have to determine whether or not it would interfere and overrule a basic stated by the Knesset. And this is why 15 of the Supreme Judges are participating with the discussion.
Sorry, I wasn't clear. I meant Netanyahu's prosecution for corruption.
Oh, for corruption. The trials are going, we've seen in the last, I think it was a few weeks ago, where some of the main witnesses, one of them was a close friend of Netanyahu, giving statements about nature of the relationship. But at the moment it's ongoing, it is a very difficult trial, especially because it was never done before. It was never a trial going against, you know, a prime minister in role. That's why it's getting even more coverage, and I'm guessing this is why it's taking even longer than it should have.
Based on what you know, do you think he is guilty of corruption?
If I answer that, I can go in and look for a position in the legal system in Israel. Yes, go ahead.
What do you in general think about Thomas Friedman? I read his book close to 30 from Beirut to Jerusalem. What do you think of him as a columnist talking about the Israeli situation? Do you see him as objective, or do you you have any opinions on him, or?
I've heard, I've actually haven't heard of Thomas Friedman before came in here.
Yeah.
I focused a little bit on the relationship between Israel and the US before that, so I was not very aware of him in Israel. I have heard right-wing supporters saying he is doing a terrible job, and I've heard left-wing supporters saying he's doing a terrible job. So my bet is that he might be doing something right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to read some of his stuff. I'll get back to you on this one.
Okay. Yeah, maybe next Monday. Okay. Catch you later.
Thank you for participating. Yes, anything else?
What's happening with Israeli tourism? Are people from the United States, elsewhere in the world, visiting Israel? Is tourism up or down or the same as it's always been?
I don't know the answer to that, but this is a brilliant opportunity to tell you about something else that is exciting. And it is that we're going to bring in the Ministry of Tourism in Israel to here, to the JCC, for an Israeli breakfast event, which is going to happen in September. Thank you, Gabe.
Do you have a date for it?
It's been, I think it's September 12th, but you're definitely going to hear it from the What's New, from the newsletters. You'll definitely hear about it everywhere. It's just not yet fully phrased, but it's going to be a brilliant event. Israeli Ministry of Tourism has an office here in New York, and they're going to bring in some of the Israeli touristic businesses to introduce Israel as a touristic option for people, and they're going to do an Israeli breakfast event here at the JCC.
Since it's a breakfast event, will they be bringing in lots of tasty Israeli food for us?
They will. Yes, and it should be good. So thank you for this setup. I really appreciate it. So I think by that we're going to conclude this day's session. I will remind you all that Golda, movie about Golda Meir, played by Helen Mirren, is coming up screening late August, which is right around the corner. So go ahead and get yourself a ticket from the What's New, from my newsletter, Facebook page, anywhere we'll post it, you can see it. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Thank you for joining in today. And I hope I'll see you all next Monday.